What are the differences between car and walker that could be opportunities for adding or subtracting issues to create more cooperative surplus? Kurt, differences?
Walker cannot walk.
Right. So walker is not
Movable.
able-bodied, okay, and car is, yeah, that's important. What else? Yes, sir. Keep going.
Has no car.
Uh-huh. So differences. So differences in you can call these sort of differences in resources, right? Okay. So we think if we think about the baseline transaction here being that Walker's probably going to pay Car some money, and Car's going to give Walker rides to school. That's great. We could just do that. Like I said before yesterday, I'm sure you could all quickly negotiate an agreement. Car might ask for a high amount of money, Walker might offer a low amount of money, maybe they'll meet somewhere in the middle, and they shake hands and that's it, right? And we have some cooperative surplus probably because, as Imke points out, they live very close together, right? So it's probably a good opportunity here, but we can do better than that, right? And so this is the point of strategic goal number 3, not to just be satisfied with the cooperative surplus that sort of magically appears in front of you based on the based on sort of the normal or baseline type of transaction. How can we make it better, right? How can we make this transaction more valuable? Okay, so let's think about this one for a minute. Valuable for Car? Yeah. Okay. Very valuable for Car, right? She doesn't know much about cars, so yes, if Walker will take care of small repairs, then that's definitely valuable for her. So now the important question is it less costly to Walker than it is valuable to Car? Right? That's what we have to think a little harder about. What was your analysis of that, Philip?
Yeah, we kind of did it in a different way. We said, because we had in our agreement, we had the part that if Walker needs to go to the doctor or something, Car would take her without like putting it into a number of charge. And would say in return there would be possibility from the one side if there's an out of.
So you traded, you log rolled, yeah. Right? Okay, so that's good, but even so let's say, we'll put this other one. So Car, you said we'll take Walker to the doctor.
Yeah.
In order to know whether this adds value, right? We would still want to ask, is it less costly for Walker than it is valuable for Car? We still want to be sure about that, because if it turns out it isn't, right? If it's very costly for Walker, then we create more value by just having this term and having Walker compensate some other way for it, right? With cash, or maybe there's some other service that he could trade. So it's important when we add issues to make sure that each one is going to create more value than it costs on its own terms. But there's one more type of cost to consider here, I think also, which is, what about the cost of possible disputes? That is this, how did you define small repairs versus large repairs? What counts?
In a very trusty relationship.
Ah, okay. All right. So, yeah, so you know, there's a trade-off here, right? That they have a good relationship. Perhaps they will be able to agree if there's some kind of repair necessary for the car. Does it fall under this requirement or does it not? But when we're thinking about how valuable is this term to Car and how costly is it to Walker, on both sides of that equation, I think we need to at least take into account the risk of a dispute arising, because there's, this is some lack of clarity here. If you think that that risk is very small, then okay, then maybe it still adds value. But when we're thinking about joint value, that's something to take into account, right? That's got to be part of the consideration. So I just want you to see how either, you think about it either way. You can divide the cooperative surplus as you go along, point by point, or you can just figure out what are all the ways to make this more and more valuable, and then let's divide the cooperative surplus at the end. Either way is fine. The question of how do we divide the cooperative surplus? And here Philip says, well, we thought about the price of a taxi in this case and the price of a bus in this case. That's what we're going to get into today, right? That's our next two topics, is exactly that problem. All right, here's a point where I want to just stop for a second and say, I think there's an important part of joint value creation that's important to think about and is often overlooked, and that's this. That if we take Timo and Ivanka's argument, say, okay, let's agree that if Carr were to teach Walker to drive, that would create more value for Walker than it would be costly to Carr. There are some costs to Carr, right? But overall, it creates more value than it reduces value, so it increases the cooperative surplus. But there's one more point I think it's necessary to consider, and that is, in a world, so what we've said is, in a world that just consists of Carr and Walker, this would be a good idea, okay? Because for the reasons Timo and Ivanka said, I'm not taking sides. Maybe Kirk is right, but we're just assuming, right? Okay? We're assuming Ivanka and Timo have got this right. But what we have to consider is that there are other people in the world too, right? For example, there are people that give driving lessons for a living. So we have to ask that the additional surplus that's created by adding this issue, we have to compare that to the amount of surplus that would be created if Walker got driving lessons from someone else. Right? So, in other words, so all of you will understand this from your business experience and your business background. If I'm going to buy I'm going to buy some low voltage electrical gizmos of some kind, right? And they're very valuable to me, right? So we realize that if I buy from Ivanka, the society of Ivanka and myself will be better off, okay, because she can produce them at less cost than the value to me. But I might be even better off, and society might be even better off if I buy my gizmos from Lena, if she can make them even cheaper than Ivanka can. Right? So here the question is, we have to say, before we add this, right, we have to really answer two questions. Does this increase the joint value of the community of Carr and Walker? So that's the first question, and we said, okay, yes. But then we have to say, well, could we create even more value for the Carr-Walker community if Walker were to transact for these services somewhere else? So we always have to consider outside options, right, when we're thinking about expanding the value of this transaction. And I think this is a point that in the real world is more obvious, because in the real world, when you're entering into a deal, right, when I'm talking to Lena about buying her Prado Scoot, I have awareness about, whether the auto body shop is running this discount special or not. But when we think about it in terms of negotiation, we usually, the way that negotiation is taught, and the way that I teach it, and the way that everybody teaches it, I think, is that we're focused on just this world of these two. And we're ignoring the rest of the world out there. And I'm saying that it's important that not only do we, it's important conceptually that we ask, is this a good term to add in our world of the two of us? But then also, remember there's another world out there, and maybe having the transaction with a third party could be even better than that. A mistake people make, they learn this idea of value creation, right? And then they go a little too far with the idea. They get so into it, right? They go a little too far and they think, they get locked into this world of two people. And they say, okay, so now pretty soon there's this whole economy that's created, right? Where Carr is cleaning Walker's apartment, and Walker is giving Carr, cooking lessons, and Carr is, they're engaged in all these transactions, right? But it would be, in many of these cases, it would be more efficient for them to engage in some of the transactions with third parties, not necessarily with each other, right? If they're going to add more transactions together, you have to ask, what are the synergies, right, to use another business term, what are the synergies that make this person the right one to add the transaction to? When it's an add-on that clearly goes along with the primary transaction, like this one, then it's obvious. When you're sort of adding a separate transaction, like these two, then you really have to at least think about whether this is the right person to be doing the transaction with. Now, another argument, sometimes the reason is yes, because there are lower transaction costs, because Carr and Walker are already negotiating this agreement. Right? They're already negotiating with each other for the rides. If Walker then, so Walker's going to need to get somebody to drive him to the store, to teach him how to drive, various other things. So one argument is, well, he doesn't have to go out and find those third parties. He's already dealing with Carr. So sometimes that's a good enough answer. Sometimes it's not a good enough answer. What else did you put in your contract? And why does that expand the cooperative surplus?
It's low cost to Walker because he seems to have some money left that he would otherwise be spent on, like a used car if he could drive.
Yeah.
And Carr was in urgent need of money because most expenses had to be paid by loans rather than by money that was available, and some of the fixed costs that Carr has have to be paid for a whole year in advance as well.
Great. So, so this falls in the category of different time preferences, right? Is that, just a general way to put this is that Carr is more in need of the money now than Walker is, right? So it increases the surplus for Walker to pay early rather than late, right? Pay in advance. Okay, great. Okay, great. And so one way to think about this, again, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, that you were looking for, the way I would put this is, when it comes time to divide the cooperative surplus, you're looking for an appropriate fairness rule, right? So you're trying to figure out, okay, so we've got this agreement, which doesn't include Mondays. Essentially, you subtracted Mondays if Walker's out, if Carr is unavailable. It's not part of the deal. If Carr is out of town on Mondays, she's not in violation of the agreement, right? That's okay. And now you're trying to decide, okay, we've got this agreement that's going to create a bunch of surplus. How do we divide that surplus? And this is a way to try to figure out what would be a way that's fair to both parties. You're looking at the market prices of taxis and buses to try to find an external source of the cash payment. Right? So this is exactly what we're gonna kind of see this in more detail this afternoon, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay, let's talk about moral hazard and adverse selection. Right. What's the moral hazard? What are the moral hazard problems here? Actually, let me start the other way. I think this makes a little more sense the other way. What are the adverse selection risks? Is there a risk of adverse selection if you are Walker? What's the adverse selection problem in this case? What's the adverse selection problem? Now, I will grant you that the adverse selection problem is not enormous, but there are often hidden adverse selection and moral hazard problems that it's important to recognize at least. What's the adverse selection problem? Lena, what's the adverse selection?
For example, that Carr is not reliable in terms of time or driving at all.
Yeah. Okay. So let's break it down this way. What is Walker getting? What are the components of what Walker is getting in this deal? So now let's think about how do you protect yourself against adverse selection risks? Lena, how do you do it?
For example, you could add a possibility to quit the contract.
Ah, okay, right. Okay, so you could add a termination clause, right? That's one way to do it, right? Is to say, well, let's structure the agreement that allows Walker the ability to back out when he learns whether he's purchased a lemon or not. Okay, could be. That would be valuable to Walker. Would it be costly to Carr?
it wouldn't be costly. You just wouldn't get any money anymore.
Yes, but I'm saying, is providing this term, we're assuming that there's a carpool agreement, there's some kind of a deal. Would adding this term to the agreement be costly to Carr?
If Carr thinks that he's reliable and he's a nice guy, then not. Otherwise, yes.
Right. Okay. So if Carr says, well, look, I know my car is safe and reliable, and I know I'm a fine driver, so sure, I'll give you the right to terminate if I turn out not to be a good driver, or my car turns out to be not reliable, because that doesn't cost me very much. You might have more of a problem if the termination clause is broader, right? So you might just have a clause. Here's a way to deal with all adverse selection problems, right? We could deal with every adverse selection problem in the world if in every agreement we gave both parties the right to unilaterally, that is by themselves, right, terminate the agreement at any time they wanted. Then we have no fear of adverse selection, because if anyone finds out they've gotten low quality, they just get out of the contract. But that's very costly, right? Because then nobody can rely on the commitments of the other parties. Ivanka's absolutely right, is that you have to balance the value of this, right? The value in terms of this transaction, that we increase value for Walker, and we at low cost to Carr. So in terms of this particular transaction, this increases the joint value. But you have to balance that against potential harms to the relationship that are caused by even bringing these things up. Right? Because in order for this deal to work out smoothly, you know that things are going to happen in the future. The parties are going to have to coordinate their behavior. They're going to have to work well together. They're going to have to get along well together. They're going to be riding together every day for the whole semester. Right? So the value, so we have to compare the value we get by eliminating the adverse selection risk against the cost to the relationship, which is sort of a social cost that depends on the context. So in this situation, yeah, I would totally agree with you. In the real, if you were really negotiating a carpool contract with Nicole, right? And you said, should I ask for her to represent that she's never had a traffic ticket? I would say no, don't be stupid, right? That would be intellectually smart and socially stupid, right? Okay. But in a complicated business transaction, right, it would be intellectually smart and not socially stupid. So you do have to, so I think you're absolutely right, you have to take that into account. That's a very fair point. Here's the social costs that Ivanka's talking about even in this situation. You might say, here's what you might say, quite reasonably. You might say, well, I don't mind providing the representations. That's okay. But here's what I mind. Here's what troubles me. If Risky is the kind of person that's asking for all these representations, and it's not customary, I might be concerned, is he hard to get along with? Right? Is he likely to sue me if some small thing goes wrong? Right? Is he going to be a pain to work with? So then maybe I say, go away, not because I'm insulted about the representations per se, but I'm now doubting how much value I'm going to get out of this transaction, because there might be problems down the road. So you do have to ask yourself, in the social context of this particular type of agreement, would asking to add terms that would create value for the transaction create more harm to the relationship? And so you might say, you know what, there's a small risk of adverse selection here. I might be getting a bad driver, not sure. But I'm going to take that risk because the alternative, so even though it would add value to the transaction to add the representation, it would harm the relationship sufficiently that overall it would be a negative rather than a positive. And in business relationships, that can be exactly the same calculation. But so here's the point, though. What I want you to do is I want you to realize there's an adverse selection problem, and realize that if you don't add this term or don't ask for this term, you are going to be taking some risk. then if you decide it's worth it to take the risk because I don't want to send the signal that I'm a bad business partner, then by all means take the risk. But know that you're taking it. Realize this is an issue. Okay, so this is the way you deal with moral hazard customarily, is you add terms, right, that give the party the incentive not to use the idiom, not to shirk their responsibilities. So you do have to be sensitive to the social context, but almost all complicated contracts, complicated agreements, have a number of terms in them that they're there to deal with moral hazard problems. Right? Make sure that once the contract is signed, right, that the other party still has the incentive to do the best possible job in fulfilling their obligations.